access this. Okay. So welcome everybody to our panel tonight on how the city is protecting itself before next time. And this is the Community Advisory Board of WNYC and WQXR. And the CABs, the Community Advisory Boards, were set up by a legislative act in 1978 so that the CABs, the Community Advisory Boards, would check on the programs and the policies of the station to be sure that they were meeting the educational needs of the community they serve. And this community board serves both WNYC and WQXR. QXR joined us a couple of years ago. So what I'd like to mention also is that this community advisory board is looking for new members for next year. So if anyone is interested in serving, you can look on a Facebook page, WNYC. What did we say that was? WNYC.org Community Advisory Board Facebook page, and you'll find it. You'll find the process if you would like to join the CAB. We have 4 panelists with us tonight. We have Andrew Freedman from Climate Central. And we have Dr. Klaus from Columbia University, and Bob Yaro from Regional Plan Association, and Leah Cohen from the City of New York. Each one will speak 10-15 minutes, and then after everyone has spoken, we'll have questions from the audience, questions among themselves, etc. So I'd like to, as soon as I get my glasses, I'd like to start with Andrew Freedman from Climate Central. He's a senior science writer from Climate Central, focusing on coverage of extreme weather and climate change. Prior to working with Climate Center, Andrew was a reporter for Congressional Quarterly and Greenwire E&E Daily. His work has also appeared in the Washington Post and online at the Weather Channel Interactive. He holds a master's in climate and society from Columbia University and a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University.
Thank you for having me. I'm just going to say a few sort of high-level thoughts that might set the stage for some of this. First of all, it's a little weird to me to be talking about an extreme event like Sandy and preparing for one just when I watched live images of a tornado destroy a community in Oklahoma this afternoon. So I'll be writing about that later, but praying about that and hoping about that for the best. Now, a little bit about Climate Central. We are a news and scientific research organization based in Princeton, New Jersey, that focuses on communicating the science of climate change and its impacts. We are not an advocacy organization, so we're not an environmental group. We're sort of an interesting hybrid as the media kind of changes. Sometimes science journalism needs new models. I come to this subject matter as a weather geek at heart. Covering extreme weather and climate over the past couple of years has been interesting, exciting, depressing, and just plain strange. It seems that in the meteorological community now, we're increasingly talking about weather as not strictly weather anymore. All weather seems suspicious. And as a weather geek, since I was in nursery school, I was not the coolest kid in high school, that kind of makes me angry in some ways, because I kind of miss when weather was just weather. We're seeing increasing extreme events of different types. We can link some of these to climate change. We can't link others to climate change. We have certain projections for both the New York region and elsewhere in terms of types of events. But what we know, the bottom line that we know that the rest of the panel is going to be talking about is the risk profile of New York City and other areas in the United States and elsewhere is changing. We know that seas are rising, and the combination of sea level rise and storms, be it an incredible event like Sandy or more of a run-of-the-mill nor'easter, those events, those impacts are increasing. Sea level rise research that Climate Central has undertaken to try to map down to the block by block level of sea level rise scenarios through 2100. We found in New York City, the odds of a 100-year flood or worse by 2030 with sea level rise is 26%. Odds without sea level rise are 8%, meaning global warming multiplies the odds by more than 3 times. When you look at the storm surge from Hurricane Sandy, there was a component in there that you can identify that was sea level rise related. Some of it related to climate change, some of it related to changing land levels. The majority of the event was weather. Global warming didn't cause Sandy, but it did increase its impacts in several different ways. So, other things that we've seen recently that lead reporters such as myself to start covering events more in a climate change context. Saw an incredible heat wave across the United States in March of 2011. We've seen the wettest day in New York City on record over the past couple of years. That being just a JFK record, though, in case anybody is really interested in that one. We had $14 billion disasters in the United States in 2011. We have what we're increasingly calling weather whiplash lately, where the Mississippi River, for example, went from record flood to record drought in 1 year and back to record flood. These are conditions that people aren't quite used to experiencing in this way. And in New York, with Sandy and with other severe weather impacts, I think we're trying to be thinking much more about resiliency, and resiliency from natural events, resiliency from climate-related changes and extremes, and figuring out how to reduce the damage from the next Hurricane Sandy. I mean, so much of what happened in Sandy was scripted down to the minute from reports that this guy, Klaus, helped write. Having done the story in July before Sandy, I explored one scenario of a hurricane hitting New York, and the runways of LaGuardia flooding, and the tunnels flooding, and the subway. This was all scripted. So watching it unfold in social media the night that Sandy made landfall was just a very surreal and sad experience. And trying to read the reports that are coming out now and figure out how to take that into account, which the city is trying to do, and regional entities and the federal government, trying to build things better for next time. One thing to recognize from Sandy, it was a confluence of extremes in the atmosphere. Just to give you a little weather perspective, you had a huge area of high pressure over Greenland that was a blocking high that wouldn't let Sandy go out to sea. That high in itself is unusual, and it's unusual in its strength for that time of year. You had unusually warm sea surface temperatures, which are somewhat related to climate change. You had a huge dip in the jet stream across the central United States. So what scenario planners look for oftentimes is not just a failure of one system or one disaster. It's what happens to critical infrastructure when multiple things come together at the same time. And in this case, just weather-wise, there were multiple things coming together at the same time to create an event of unprecedented magnitude and scope in New York. But I do think, that this definitely erased the notion of that a 100-year flood 20, 30 years ago is the same as a 100-year flood now or in the future. I'm going to pass it to Klaus, who, like I said, was remarkably prescient in advance of the storm. We tend not to listen to people like him, at least not to the letter, because it's usually, I don't know, a little bit expensive. Some of the things that certain scenarios suggest that we need to do to prepare for extreme events. But hopefully we can get a good dialogue going as we continue about what the city is considering and what experts like him think that we should be considering.
All right, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to Klaus now, so you know whom you're listening to. He's a geophysicist and an emeritus research professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and he teaches disaster risk management at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. Since 2008, he's serving on the Mayor's New York City panel on climate change and New York State's Climate Aid project. He prepared the MTA's Climate Change Adaptation Plan and co-authored the U.S. National Academy's report on impacts of climate change on U.S. transportation. Prior seismological research took him to 5 continents, and venturing into earthquake engineering and co-authorship of the New York City and National Seismic Building Codes. Dr. Jacob received his PhD in geophysics in Germany in the late 1960s, and he's since been with Columbia University.
Thank you for having me here and joining my colleagues on the panel here. I come from not the climate side. I come really from looking at risk in general, and then over the last 10 years, I applied this methodology in assessing risks to the climate and weather situation, and to, of course, the metropolitan area in whichever form it now has emerged over its historic development. And particularly, I have focused on assessing the risk to its infrastructure, and there in particular I focused on the transportation system, because I think New York City, for instance, without its subway system, without its other rail mass transit, whether that's Long Island Railroad, whether it's Metro North, whether it's New Jersey Transit, even Amtrak and others, is not the city that can economically function. So, in putting a risk profile together, let's quickly understand what is risk. Risk is really the hazard, and it's the probability of hazards, times the value of the assets that are exposed to that hazard, times the vulnerability of the assets, and that vulnerability, of course, is also a function of the hazard itself. That means the vulnerability is higher when the hazard is higher, when the flood height is higher, then of course you get more damage. So when you put all these things together, you actually can make very quantitative forecasts as to what the expected losses is, because risk is really also the expected future losses. And that's exactly what our mission was, both through the NPCC that was created by the mayor in 2008, and then a year later, the so-called Climate Aid study. And there we made this profile of the risk for the transportation system. I forgot one other agency, that's the PATH trains, of course, of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And when you get full cooperation, as we did, from the stakeholders, you can come out with amazing details as to what the risk profile is. So we happened to forecast for a scenario. We didn't predict Sandy. That's sometimes people say we predicted this. No, we didn't. We took simply a case study where we took a 100-year storm and see what would happen. It turns out that profile coincides, even so the 100-year storm can be discussed, amazingly close to what Sandy thought of us. But the important thing from that study was that an agency such as, for instance, the MTA, in particular the New York City Transit System, went into the tunnels after they shut down the system 24 hours before, took out all the electric signals, brought them to the surface, the tunnels flooded, they pumped out the water, and put the signals back in. That was in part, at least, due to that study that we had done together with them, because they knew which tunnels would flood and which one would not flood. That saved New Yorkers about 2 to 3 weeks of downtime of the subway system. And so this is an important lesson to learn. If you are serious about it and want to know what your risk exposure is, go to your engineers and work with scientists, and you can get an extraordinarily clear picture where your risk exposure is. Now, that's only one part of the story, because now you want to fix the problem. And Sandy was only the lesson that, well, we lost the race against time. And it's not clear whether we have learned enough in terms of the public will to really spend the necessary money, even so there's money to some degree in the pipeline from Washington, D.C. as a result of Sandy. But that may not be enough to fix the problem. Certainly not for the infrastructure in its totality, and certainly not to the residential exposure on the waterfront in the city and on the waterfront facing the Atlantic Ocean. So, there are fundamentally 3 ways to adapt or cure the problem. The first is through protection, and there are 2 sub-forms of protection. One would be through a central barrier system that has been brought up and discussed. Nothing is decided, of course. You can do it decentralized by protecting block by block, or if you like, building by building, and make it sort of waterproof, costs money. The second form is by accommodation. You let the water in, both into the streets and into the building. You sort of, what FEMA would call wet-proof it. In other words, you put your electric connections to an elevation where the water comes in, the water goes out, you clean up, but nothing else really happens. So you can bring back the functionality of an office building, of whatever the facility is, very, very quickly. On an urban planning scheme, accommodation would be, for instance, well, you all know our wonderful High Line not far from here. I see many more High Lines in the future in the city where we can walk from one building to the next building and look down, as I always say, on Wall Street in a puddle with ducks floating around on Wall Street. That's a little bit of simplistic allegory, but I think we have to think about solutions like that, particularly in downtown, where we have so many assets invested in that we just can't abandon them. And that brings me to the third and final adaptation option, and that is planned, managed, strategic retreat, either to higher ground laterally and up, or in place by simply raising houses where they're small enough and can be raised. And raised, I mean by not raising by destroying them, by raising in terms of elevating them. Or by bringing some of the installations out of the ground or sub-grade floors up into the 3rd or 10th floor, and have those buildings really made sort of useful above a certain level, and give up some of the commercial or rental spaces in the lowest levels. So these are fundamentally the 3 options, and I'm sure others, in particular Leah, may expand on that, how the city thinks right now. What would be the right mixture between these 3 approaches of protecting and defending through engineered structures, accommodating, inviting the water into our city and sometimes buildings, and thirdly, moving to higher ground. The latter is obviously, from a political and from an individual psychological point of view, the hardest to swallow. My personal fear is, but I see actually an opportunity in that in the long run we may have to give up some portions of our settled areas. Probably not downtown Manhattan, but some other parts, and we can go through neighborhood and neighborhood. I won't mention them because those who live there may feel singled out. But I feel sooner or later there will be at least partial retreat, and it's just a question of time when that will hit home. With that, I hand it over.
Okay.
Okay, let me just explain now. We're going to have to wait to see what the city thinks about, we're going to have to wait a bit to see how the city will respond. I'd like us to hear from Bob Yaro next. He's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Regional Plan Association, the nation's oldest independent metropolitan policy, research, and advocacy group. Bob is a member of Mayor Bloomberg's Sustainability Advisory Board that helped prepare Plan New York City 2030, and he was recently appointed to the Governor's New York Works Task Force, charged with developing a long-range infrastructure investment strategy for New York State. He also founded and co-chairs America 2050, RPA's initiative to create a national development and infrastructure plan for the entire United States. Since 2002, he has been professor of practice for the University of Pennsylvania. He holds a master's in city and regional planning from Harvard University.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, this is, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. And I hope that we get into a conversation, into a dialogue fairly soon, because there are a number of interesting perspectives on this challenge. I guess the one thing we'll probably all agree on is that events like Sandy are not isolated events, and that for starters, I like to paraphrase Winston Churchill and remind everybody that that New Yorkers are an island race. We live on an archipelago, and which means that occasionally we have to plan to get our feet wet, or at least to get perhaps better acquainted with the waterfront than we would like to be. And I remember Kevin Burke, the CEO at Con Ed, right after Sandy got up, and Kevin is a fairly conservative business leader, but he said, whether you agree on the causes of climate change or not, whether it's man-made or not, what you have to agree on if you live in this city is that there are changes underway in our climate. We've had 2 major storms in a little over 2 years take a left turn at the Virginia Capes when traditionally they've taken a right turn. We've had, Kevin said, something like 7 tornadoes in the last decade in New York City, and I grew up in New York City, and Kevin did, and we didn't have tornadoes. The tornadoes were things that happened in Kansas, and Oklahoma. They didn't happen here, or at least not very often. And we've had we haven't had any drought events, but we've had a number of severe rainfall events. One of which triggered the MTA panel that Klaus was on, and I served on as well. Which prepared the MTA better than most other big infrastructure agencies for the kind of event that occurred. Interesting just to compare the MTA's preparedness for this storm and Jersey Transit's, for example, where they left hundreds of rail cars in the Meadowlands where they flooded and caused tremendous loss. So New Yorkers need to prepare for events of this kind. I like to say that we've had everything but plague and locusts in the last decade, and maybe those are coming too. So
This is the year of the locust.
the locusts are coming, so stand by. And so the only prudent thing to do is to prepare for it. And then the question is, well, what do you do to prepare? And Klaus, laid out the major categories of things that we can do. Mother Nature will help us make decisions. There are parts of this city and of this region. There are communities that are on filled wetlands, in a number of places here in Manhattan. And one of the things that at the very beginning of the Governor's Commission, there was a presentation by the engineers from Arab of the Manhattan maps of Manhattan, which are a recreation of the 17th century pre-Columbian, pre-Henry Hudson maps of Manhattan, and then an overlay where and those showed where the wetlands were, where the swamps were along the edge, and where the wetlands were, where the stream was that ran along Canal Street just below here. All the way across Manhattan and so forth. And then an overlay of where the flooding occurred. And it was a dead ringer. It was all the places that we filled, and we didn't fill very well in many cases. Some places we filled in Battery Park City, for example, where we had a little extra fill to go around from the World Trade Center site that we were able to elevate sufficiently. And they didn't have any flooding in Sandy, but most of the other places did flood. In large areas of South Brooklyn, South Queens, the South Shore of Staten Island, the Rockaways, and so forth. 750,000 Brooklynites alone in one borough, for example, were in areas that experienced flooding in this storm. And about 1.5 million residents of the region as a whole experienced flooding in this event and are now in the new flood maps. And so part of what's going to help us down Klaus's curve here of decision making is Mother Nature herself is going to help, because these are going to be repeated events. They'll have a little help from the federal flood insurance program, which last year was amended, moved by the Republicans. I remember the number now. I think it's something like $13 billion in deficit just in the last 18 months. The federal flood insurance program is supposed to be a break-even program, and it hasn't been. It's been deeply subsidized and increasingly subsidized by taxpayers across the country. And the Congress last year essentially created new requirements that the program become self-supporting and that the rates be increased, and to the point where the average rate in these flood zones, and they're now I'm trying to remember the number now, but I know it's 1.5 million in the region as a whole, and I think it's a little under 1 million. I think it's like 900,000 New Yorkers live in these new zones that have been mapped by FEMA. And the average flood insurance bill is going to be about $15,000, and a larger number of New Yorkers in places where there are higher property values, and there tend to be a number of waterfront communities where you pay a premium for those nice water views and so forth that are reflected in the property values and reflected in the insurance rates. And many of those places will be paying $30,000 or $4,000 a year. That's going to help with an adaptation strategy. Growing numbers of New Yorkers. If it isn't enough to get their feet wet, if they're going to find that just paying those flood insurance bills are going to discourage them from wanting to be there and wanting to rebuild and so forth, that we'll start to see people voting with their feet and making decisions not to be in these places. And we will have catastrophic events like this one. I'm a sailor, and I was on the Connecticut shore this past weekend, and it's always interesting to go along the southern New England coast, and you can pick out two kinds of coastal communities. The ones that got whacked in 1938 or 1954, the big hurricanes, to the extent that they were cleaned out and the decision was made. Usually it's after, in communities where volunteer firemen died trying to evacuate people after they refused to be evacuated. And many of those communities made the decision to not to rebuild and to essentially acquire these sites after they've been cleared by hurricanes, or nor'easters, as conservation areas. And those places do really well in storms like this. The dunes get pummeled, and they're breakthroughs sometimes in barrier islands and barrier beaches and so forth, but they almost always recover. Now that'll change with sea level rise, it's not entirely clear how well they'll recover. They'll retreat and they'll recover in different locations and so forth. Those places do fine. It's the places that you can see these two on the Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts shores. They didn't get a direct hit from the hurricane, or where the decision was made to rebuild instead of to retreat. In those places, they get whacked again and again and again, and we keep bailing them out again. It's a very expensive, proposition, bailing these places out. We have communities like West Hampton Dunes on the South Shore of Long Island. They're only in New York could you have an incorporated municipality without a single year-round resident, and they incorporated for the purpose of essentially litigating against the Army Corps of Engineers to make sure that jetties and dunes and so forth were rebuilt after these storms. So it's an expensive hobby doing it. I don't want to go too far into things, but I also wanted to mention, and Klaus has heard me say this before, I live in Stamford, Connecticut, which is one of 3 communities in the Northeast that has a surge barrier, hurricane barrier. And it was designed in the 50s, built in the 60s. Used to close every 3 or 4 years when there was a serious nor'easter and so forth, and now closes 2 or 3 times a year. It's a 17-foot high barrier. It was designed for a Category 2 hurricane, and it was designed after, and the 2 other places in the Northeast that have these things are Providence, Rhode Island, and New Bedford. All 3 cities, how did these places get hurricane barriers? And the answer is that all 3 places had 2 devastating storms that killed a lot of people, did a lot of damage within a generation. And I like to say that as a species we're not really very smart. My friend Bill McDonough reminds me that it took us 10,000 years to put wheels on luggage. So and one of the things about not being very smart is that if these things happen only once in a while, and my definition of once in a while is less frequently than once in a generation, we forget about them. And people say, well, that'll never happen again. We really don't need to do anything different than we just did. And so these 3 places have hurricane barriers, and we had an 11-foot surge in Stamford. We had no damage inside the hurricane barrier. The city's been zoning and using its building regulations now for the last 50 years to pull development back inside behind the hurricane barrier. All the new intensive, condominium development, commercial development in downtown is protected. There was no flooding. The lights stayed on. A very different story than in neighboring communities where there was a lot of flooding and the lights did not stay on. And so I think that that in fact in high-value locations, like Lower Manhattan, certainly in large areas, the 5 boroughs, we have high population density, and I describe high value as not just real estate values, but places where there are large concentrations of population, regardless of their income, that we need to protect these places. And I think that we'll find, it may be, I like to think that Irene was storm number 1 and Sandy was storm number 2 in this requirement, almost a biblical kind of approach to things, right, Klaus? Like 30 years in the desert, or 40 years in the desert, and so forth. How many plagues and locusts do you have to have before you make it into the Old Testament? But 2 storms, 2 devastating storms within a generation. I like to think that Irene was storm number 1, but I'm not sure, because New York, we got off easy on that one. Upstate New York, they got clobbered, and which is why the Governor's 2100 Commission didn't just look at coastal storms, it looked at rain events, it looked at droughts, it looked at heat waves, a whole range of things that have affected different parts of New York State. But if it did qualify, then I hope that we learn our lesson and that we strongly consider the kinds of approaches that Klaus just mentioned. That we need to protect some highly developed areas. And one other thought, and that is, I teach in Philadelphia, and I used to live and teach in Boston, and I've spent time in Chicago. What do these 3 cities have in common? The answer is all 3 of them have adapted to to flooding events in different ways. In Philadelphia, the Schuylkill River floods periodically, and the solution to the problem 100 years ago, when the city extended west of the Schuylkill into West Philly, where the University of Pennsylvania is, and the decision was made to essentially extend the grades of the streets, the east-west streets, Walnut and Chestnut and Locust and the others, at a grade that is the equivalent of the ground level at around, I don't know, it's about 25th Street or something like that, 24th Street. And then those streets extend across the Schuylkill Valley, and then they meet the grades again at around 32nd Street. And the buildings that were there before the streets went in, the ground floor and the first floor are now sometimes two levels below the street level, and those are now basement levels. And what used to be the third floor is now the lobby. And all the utilities have been moved up. The river floods periodically, and 99 out of 100 residents of the city don't even have an idea that this is going on. They just assume that the grade of the city just continued to cross the river. The floods come in, the floods go out, and it doesn't cause any damage. In Boston, 112 years ago, 115 years ago, after repeated flooding in the Back Bay and in East Cambridge, the decision was made to build the Charles River Dam. And the dam was rebuilt about 30 years ago when it needed to be raised because of sea level and because of the amount of paving and so forth, urbanization in the Charles River Basin. And the Army Corps of Engineers built it, and there's no flooding in the Back Bay, and we're in East Cambridge and so forth. Life goes on, highest value real estate in New England. It's protected by a dam that keeps the water out. Chicago is another interesting case. They have problems of flooding on the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. And what they did is they raised the city, and they did it in a number of different ways. Some of it on fill, some of it with barriers, essentially seawalls and so forth. And if you look down at, from the level of the city, you'll see Wacker Drive one level down, and the water comes in, floods Wacker Drive periodically, water goes out again. So we've been adapting to climate change in cities across the United States. Maybe it's New York's turn. We're a little late to the party, but it's time for us to think about doing that. I happen to be somebody who thinks that we should look at a range of structural and non-structural solutions. I think we need to be thinking about dunes and wetlands restoration on barrier beaches and barrier islands, the South Shore of Long Island, places, you look at the South Shore of Long Island, it's like Swiss cheese, there are thousands of little canals and so forth. You cannot build a barrier that'll keep all the water out. And there we need to be thinking about, about elevating structures and retreat and so forth. We can do some things to deal with wave action. We can fortify the barrier beaches, make sure the dunes work and so forth to mitigate the surges. But in the heart of the region, I think we do need to consider a surge barrier like the ones that London has built, that St. Petersburg has built, the network of typhoon barriers that Tokyo has built, and other our competitors around the world have built. Very expensive, takes a long time to build. Big question on how you engineer something like that around the Hudson River. We've got this little problem. We've got this big, this river with a lot of drainage coming down the river, particularly during storm events and so forth. How do we engineer that? It's different than the Thames Valley or the Gulf of Finland before St. Petersburg. But I think we need to consider it. Army Corps of Engineers has some money to take a look at it, and I think we need to go on with our eyes open and consider it. People tell me that it will cost too much. It's probably a $15 to $20 billion project. But the question goes back to how many $60 and $80 billion storm events do we have to have before we consider doing something? At least look at it and see if it works or not. And people tell me it'll take too long. Well, if it gives us, it gives us 80 years to figure out, what a retreat strategy looks like or what some of these other things look like. But that's time and money well spent. So I think looking at a range of approaches, I like your trinity here, the different adaptation strategies. I would assume that we're about to hear that the city is considering all of these things, and this is going to take a serious look at all of these things, and we'll turn the baton over to you.
Okay, so Leah Cohen is the Director of Climate Analysis for the Mayor's Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, and a Senior Policy Advisor with the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability in the city. She is responsible for coordinating development of information about the climate risk facing the world and being used to inform the initiative's work to rebuild communities impacted by Sandy and increased city resilience to the effects of climate change. Prior to Sandy, she worked with other city agencies to develop and implement city resilience efforts under Plan New York City, which is Mayor Bloomberg's long-term sustainability plan. Previously, Leah worked on federal climate adaptation at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and on urban sustainability at the Mayor's office in San Francisco. She's a graduate of Stanford University, the Harvard Law School, and Harvard Kennedy School. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for having me. I did prepare some slides. I feel very formal now, but I think I'll walk you through them. The idea was just to give you a little bit more background on what the city has been doing leading up to the storm to increase resilience, and then how those efforts have been expanded and accelerated post-Sandy. So go to the next slide. So I just want to give you, as I mentioned, a quick overview of some of the work that we're doing, and then talk with you a little bit about some of the early findings from the special initiatives work. So, as I mentioned, the administration's been thinking about addressing the causes and the impacts of climate change for quite some time. Since the launch of Plan YC in 2007, which is the mayor's long-term sustainability plan, we've had a commitment not only to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but also have had a number of initiatives in place to increase our resilience. And I'm fortunate to sit next to Klaus today, who's on our New York City panel on climate change and was helping us to understand what our climate hazards were facing the city, as well as Bob, who's on our Sustainability Advisory Board and has overseen a lot of the work under Plan YC. So, next slide. Obviously, Sandy really made clear the need to expand and expedite a lot of the work that had been going on at the city. So, you know, I was one of the folks that had actually been mobilized to the Office of Emergency Management and spent about 6 weeks, more or less, living there, doing a range of things from fuel rationing plans to emergency generator coordination. And at the beginning of December, the mayor sort of called us back to City Hall and launched this new special initiative and really tasked us with answering 3 questions. So the first was, what happened during Sandy and why? The second was, what could happen in the future? And for there, he said, you know, that don't just think about coastal storms like Sandy, you need to think about the full range of climate hazards that are facing the city. And so we're doing that for both the 2020s, but also the 2050s, which is a longer term time frame. And then the third question is really, you know, so what do we do with that information? How do we rebuild post-Sandy and also prepare the city for a future with climate change? So we brought on a large team of folks to help us out with this work. As was mentioned, Seth Hinsky, who's normally the head of the Economic Development Corporation, has stepped away from his position for the last 6 months to lead this effort. And we have a bunch of other teams helping us. First and probably most importantly, we've got an outreach team that has been going out and doing extensive engagement with different community groups, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We've got a group focused on understanding our different infrastructure systems as well as the built environment, and starting to think about what is it that we need to do to increase the resilience of each of those different systems. We also have a group of folks focused on developing community rebuilding and resiliency plans in the neighborhoods that were impacted by the storm. And then there's the climate analysis group, and that's the group that I head, and that's the group that's really providing all of the information about what the hazards are that we face today and in the future that's being used to inform the planning efforts. So as I mentioned, we've got a pretty extensive outreach process over the past few months. We've engaged both city, state, and federal agencies, as well as many rounds and briefings with elected officials, as well as community boards. We've spent a lot of time with community-based organizations, as well as business and civic leaders, and also had a series of public workshops and different meetings with New Yorkers. So we're on a very tight time frame. As I mentioned, this was launched in December. We are going to be releasing our report either later this month or early June. so you can look out for that. Thank you. And so now I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the early findings from the work that we've been doing. So starting out with understanding the storm, go to the next slide. As has been mentioned, Sandy was a very unique storm. It was a unique combination of factors that really came together to produce unprecedented impacts. So for example, it was a very large storm. What you can see here on the left is the wind field of Hurricane Katrina, and on the right is Hurricane Sandy, and you see that the gusts extended about 1,000 miles with Sandy, 3 times the size of the wind field with Hurricane Katrina. Next slide. As has also been mentioned, there was this unique kink in the jet stream, this sort of high pressure system that blocked Sandy from veering off the coast into the Atlantic as most storms would normally do, and caused it to take that famous left turn, which really put the city right in the direct path of the storm, into the path of the onshore winds. And that led, among other things, to really record-shattering surge. We had about 14 feet of surge at the battery. It had surpassed the last record, which had been set by Hurricane Donna in 1960 by more than 30%. Another unique thing about Sandy was actually its timing. What you can see on the top is basically the colors correspond to water levels in the Atlantic and leading into the battery. And you can see just before the storm arrived that that light green is showing you that high tide was coming in at the battery. And then along the lower pictures, you can see that Sandy's surge arrived just at the time when we were having high tide at the battery, which really led to those record water levels that you're seeing with the bright red color. At the same time, because we were in the path of those onshore winds, hurricanes or tropical storms move in a counterclockwise direction. And so as the storm was heading towards us, you had a shift in the wind direction from the northeast to the southeast, and that really created a lot of that incredible wave action that we saw along the south and east shores of Staten Island and other coastal facing areas that don't typically see quite so much wave action. So that all led to certain very specific impacts in the city, and it's a little bit hard to see from the slides here, but what you're seeing in the blue circled areas are essentially what we call the red and yellow tagged buildings, and those are the buildings that our Department of Buildings said sustained significant structural damage. Those are all areas that have a lot of single-family homes that experienced a lot of that wave action and where we had structural damage. And then in the Upper Harbor, which is circled in red, that's the area where we had more still water flooding, and the damage that you saw was really more mechanical and electrical and other building contents. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we understand Sandy and what could happen to the city in the future. As I mentioned before, Sandy was a pretty unique storm that came together in a very specific way, which means that it is unlikely to come back in exactly the same form in the future, but it did serve to remind us that we, as a city with 520 miles of coastline, are a very vulnerable city and could just as easily be seeing impacts in different ways in different parts of the city in the future, and we need to really think about all that. So what you're seeing up here is FEMA's flood maps as they had been created in 1983, and it's a little hard to see, but the light blue is what FEMA said was the 100-year floodplain when it went and mapped those in 1983. As of today, we have about 220,000 residents. Those areas account for about 190,000 jobs and about 374 million square feet of floor area. So it wasn't really a surprise to us prior to Sandy that we already had a lot of stuff that was at risk. Next slide. Sandy reminded us that we were more vulnerable than we had previously thought, and what you see in this slide is really the purple is that 100-year floodplain, and then the orange is the area that was flooded during Sandy. And you can see that fully a third of those red and yellow tagged buildings, those buildings that we use as an indicator of significant damage, were outside that 100-year floodplain and outside the area where we had any sort of flood protection standards in our building code.